He slapped me. In my wedding dress, whites, in front of 280 guests, CEOs, Navy SEALs, generals, my brothers, his board members, and then he called my medals silly. That was the last gift my father gave me. A public humiliation wrapped in designer rage. I'm Millicent Draper, Lieutenant Commander in the United States Navy, daughter of Victor Draper, billionaire real estate mogul, Forbes cover darling, the man who raised sons to inherit his empire and a daughter to stay silent. But I didn't stay silent. Not when he cut me off for choosing the military. Not when he ghosted every deployment, every promotion. And not when he tried to strike me down one final time in a chapel filled with people who had bled beside me. So if you're wondering how we got to the moment my SEAL fiancé gripped my father's wrist and changed everything, you need to know what came before the slap. Because that wasn't the breaking point. It was the reckoning. I heard the slap before I felt it. A sharp crack split through the chapel, ricocheting off stained glass and stone, slicing through the silence like a whip. My cheek lit up with heat, but I didn't flinch. I stayed upright, steady, like I had in Kandahar dust storms, like I had on the heaving decks off Okinawa. Because this wasn't the first time my father had tried to knock me down. It was just the first time he did it in front of 280 people. I stood in my navy dress whites at the center of St. John's Cathedral in Houston, Texas, on my wedding day, and the man who hit me wasn't a stranger. He wasn't a battlefield adversary. He was Victor Draper, my father, chairman of Draper Real Estate Group, real estate titan, Forbes darling, a man America adored for his empire, and the man who had never once respected mine. I had just reached the halfway mark of the aisle, between two worlds. To my left, dark suits, silk ties, polished cufflinks, the weight of wealth and whispers. To my right, combat uniforms, ribbons, prosthetic limbs, and eyes that had seen war beside me. And then he stood, my father, blocking the aisle like a marble statue dressed in designer cloth. His voice sliced the air with surgical precision. "Take off those silly medals!" I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I simply said, no. That was when his hand came down. It wasn't just a slap against skin. It was a blow against every deployment I'd endured. Every night I'd spent in a tent, scanning radio static, wondering if dawn would come. He struck not just his daughter, but the life she had fought to earn. I hadn't even moved when James stepped forward. No shouting, no theatrics, just calm, controlled force as he gripped my father's wrist, his voice low, steady, deadly clear. "You just struck a decorated U.S. Navy officer." And then they stood. All of them. All 280 guests. Not in protest, not in panic, but in collective witness. In that moment, I was no longer just Victor Draper's daughter. I was mine. I grew up in a mansion. At least that's what it looked like from the outside. The Draper estate in Highland Park, Dallas, had been featured in more real estate magazines than I could count. Mahogany-paneled walls, baccarat chandeliers, a 3-story wine cellar, and a grand piano no one had touched in 17 years. But there was no warmth, no scent of pancakes in the morning, no lazy Sunday breakfasts, just the click of polished shoes, the tick of clocks tracking productivity, and compliments that sounded like stock reports. My brothers, Henry, Kyle, and Nathan, were the Draper triple threat, monogrammed shirts since preschool, golf lessons with Dad, IPO simulations before puberty. And me? You'll be judged by the man you marry, not what you do. That's what my father said to me more than once, without ever really looking me in the eyes. My mother was different. She didn't argue with him. She didn't challenge him, but she slipped small rebellions into my life. Books about Amelia Earhart, a leather notebook that said, "You're worth more than your father's definition." One night, she left a brochure for the U.S. Naval Academy tucked inside my desk drawer. I looked at her, wide-eyed. She smiled softly. "You don't need to inherit anything, Millie. You just need to live true." I held on to that paper like a talisman for years, until the day I mailed in my application to Annapolis. I remember exactly what dinner looked like the night I told them. Same as every other night. Silver cutlery, medium rare steak, golden lighting, and the kind of silence that felt colder than any argument. I waited until after Dad asked Henry about his Morgan Stanley interview. Then, I said it. I've submitted my application to the Naval Academy. The silence snapped. Nathan choked on his water. Kyle rolled his eyes. Dad set his knife down. The oak table groaned beneath the weight of the moment. Athe, if you go through with this military nonsense, don't ever walk back into this house. I didn't cry. I didn't explain myself. I just turned to my mother, and she nodded, no tears. Just a look that said, "You can survive this." 3 months later, my mother died of pancreatic cancer. Her last handwritten note to me said just one line. Hold on to what's true, even when no one claps for it. I've kept that line with me in every deployment since. It sits beside my military ID, behind my credit card, and somewhere deep inside me, where the applause never mattered anyway. I still remember the first time I stood on the Naval Academy's training field. 5 Mum. Cold enough that my skin stung through the stiff cotton of my uniform. A junior officer walked past me, glanced down, and smirked. Draper's little princess, here to play soldier before heading back to golf clubs and private jets. Huh? I didn't answer. I dropped down and kept doing crunches, counted every rep in my head, and turned his filth into fuel. The first 4 years of service, I didn't try to prove anything to my father. I wasn't out to make a point. I served because I knew I was right. No letters home, no calls at Christmas, no expectations of hearing, "I'm proud of you," a phrase I hadn't heard since I was 10. Still, I tried. Once, after the ambush in Helmand, Afghanistan, I was a logistics officer, not combat. But that night, when a transport truck went up in flames, I belly crawled through sand to drag a wounded corporal out from under it. When the chopper finally touched down, and my uniform was soaked in blood that wasn't mine, I was handed a commendation medal. I sent my father a photo. I'm standing next to the colonel, saluting with my right hand, the medal case in my left. A week later, I got an envelope back. No note, no words, just a full-page magazine clipping. Nathan Draper named youngest CFO in Texas history. Scrawled in his handwriting beneath it, "Now this is real success." I fed the paper into the base's incinerator, and for the first time in my life, I watched a fire burn and felt no warmth at all. I met James at Naval Station Pensacola during a joint logistics coordination briefing. I was walking through a backup supply route plan, dry, technical, 3 hours of diagrams, and maybe 4 hours of sleep. My bun was crooked. My voice cracked on slide 7. I didn't expect anyone to care, but after the session ended, he walked straight up to me, training gloves still on, calm eyes, no performance, no rank games. "You're not just moving supplies," he said. His voice was low, grounded. "You're moving lives." I froze, not because it was flattery, but because it was the first time someone saw me, not my last name, not my rank, just me. We started with mess hall dinners, then late-night coffee, then shared PT sessions that lasted longer than needed. James didn't fill space with noise. He let silence settle, stay, and speak. He remembered I don't eat sugar, that I hate tomatoes, that I'd excuse myself anytime someone started a sentence with, "You're pretty smart for a woman." One rainy night in Norfolk, we walked the pier. Grit blew from the dock and stung my cheek. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "I can't promise calm seas," he said, "but I'll row with you." I didn't cry, didn't need to. I just nodded. The next week, I sent a simple card back home to Dallas. "I'm getting married. St. John's Cathedral, 1,300 hours. I'll be in uniform." No RSVP expected, just a reminder. I no longer needed his permission to live true. There was no reply to my wedding invitation, no message, no phone call, not even a blank email. But I knew he would come, not out of love, Not even obligation. He would come because the idea of people whispering he didn't show up to his only daughter's wedding would sting his pride more than the sight of me in uniform ever could. And I was right. 3 days before the wedding, at a small pre-ceremony dinner in Austin, hosted by my aunt, who always tried to stay in Victor Draper's good graces, he arrived, black tailored suit, champagne gold cufflinks, Italian leather shoes. His cologne hit me like fresh varnish in a boardroom. Powerful, artificial, overdone. I turned away, ready to pretend he didn't exist. He didn't let me. He leaned in close, voice low enough that only I could hear it. "You're not wearing that uniform in front of Houston's elite." I swallowed hard. Cold air scraped down my throat, but I didn't step back. "I'm not marrying you," I said. "I'm marrying James, and I'll wear what tells the truth." He backed off, poured himself a bourbon, stared at me like I was a balance sheet he'd already decided to write off. That night, while pressing my dress whites in my officers' quarters at Ellington Field, my phone buzzed, a number I hadn't saved, but would never forget. I opened the message. "You'll regret this tomorrow." I turned the phone off. No shaking, no fear, just me, unfolding my mother's last handwritten letter from the pocket over my heart and tracing the words she left me. "Hold on to what's true, even when no one claps for it." I stood in the side hallway of St. John's Cathedral. The air carried wax and cedar, and a draft slid in through the narrow stone cracks. Hill stood at my left, the man who'd led us through Syria when we had no backup and no margin for error. Torres stood at my right, prosthetic leg, combat medal, a grin like he'd seen hell and come back to laugh at it. Both were in full uniform, silent. We weren't heading into a battle, but we carried the same weight. "You look like a commander before the field," Hill said, eyes steady. "Only difference this time," Torres added. "We're walking with you." I peeked through the chapel doors. 280 guests. To the left, crisp collars, $5,000 suits, champagne smiles. People who came for power, for networking, for Victor Draper. To the right, uniforms, scars, grit, silence. People who'd served, bled, and buried alongside me. I stepped forward. Each footfall echoed against stone, syncing with my heartbeat. Sunlight poured through stained glass, catching on the rows of medals across my chest, not as decoration, but as record. Halfway down the aisle, he stood. No one stopped him. No one looked surprised. My father stepped into the center, shoes pounding like a gavel. He planted himself between me and James, between my past and my choice. "Take off those silly medals," he said. Not loud, but loud enough. Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. I looked him in the eye and said, "No." He raised his hand. The slap landed hard, my cheek flared hot. The sound cracked through the chapel like a bullet. A glass shattered behind me. Someone gasped, but I didn't fall. I just stood there, still, calm, like every soldier learns to do when the ground beneath you shakes. The air inside the chapel turned dense, suffocating. No one spoke. No one breathed. Somewhere near the stained glass windows, I heard a sharp inhale, tight, panicked. I caught the flicker in Hill's eyes, like the spark before a detonation. Torres stood frozen, one hand curling slowly around the carbon shaft of his cane. But before I could move, before I could even step back, he was there. James. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make a scene. He simply stepped forward, one calm, measured stride like crossing a line drawn a decade ago. He reached out, the same hand that had steadied me during turbulence, held mine beneath war-zone rotors, and wrapped it gently, firmly, around my father's wrist. It wasn't forceful. It didn't need to be. It was final. Then he spoke. No shouting. No anger. Just 8 words. "You just struck a decorated U.S. Navy officer." The silence cracked. Hill's voice rang out, crisp and sharp. "Admiral on deck." Every military guest in the chapel, from battle-worn veterans to silver-haired commanders, rose to attention in unison. Uniforms straightened, hands snapped to brows. Even some civilians, unsure but respectful, stood in quiet awe. 280 people, many of whom had once toasted my father in boardrooms, now looked at him like something small. Victor Draper, who could silence a conference room with a single glance, stood trembling, still caught in James's grasp, but no longer as a mogul, only as a man who had lost the one currency he couldn't reclaim: respect. My father stepped back. James let go of his wrist, slowly, deliberately, like releasing something fragile or already broken. He didn't glare, didn't spit words like fire. He just looked at him, with the calm of a man who'd seen true war and decided this didn't deserve a single bullet more. That look said everything. There's nothing left to say. My father turned his head, instinctively, to the left side of the chapel, the side filled with his people, financiers, developers, legacy donors, men and women who had once built their reputations off proximity to his. They looked back at him now with something colder than fear, recognition that the man they'd admired, envied, followed, had just struck a decorated U.S. Navy officer, had just slapped his own daughter, not in private, but in front of the nation's uniform. No one stood up for him. No one interrupted James. No one even cleared their throat. My father, Victor Draper, lowered his head, not out of remorse, but out of loss. He turned, walked back up the aisle, past names he once used like currency, past silence thick enough to drown in, and then he slipped out the rear door, his shadow vanishing with him. No applause, no speech, no empire to carry with him. For years, he ruled my childhood with the line, "Don't make me look bad." And now, the only thing left behind him was the echo of a man who had made himself small, without any help from me. I didn't follow, I didn't even watch him leave, because in that moment, I understood something that had taken me 32 years and 3 combat zones to learn. I didn't need his approval to know I was right. James stepped back beside me, eyes steady, hand brushing mine, not for support, but for solidarity. Hill and Torres, who had walked through more of this world with me than my father ever had, silently stepped aside. Their role was done. The battle had been fought, and I was still standing. Then the chaplain, his voice tight and shaking, leaned into the mic. "Shall we continue?" I didn't hesitate. I didn't look back. I nodded once, firm and clear. "Yes, let's begin." The ceremony went on. No fireworks, no grand gestures, but it was true, and it was ours. James held my hand, steady and strong, just like the first time I met him in a training camp in Florida. The same hand that once pulled someone from a riptide. That wrote transfer requests for teammates too broken to ask. That tapped me gently between the shoulder blades when I couldn't breathe from the weight of flashbacks. When the chaplain said, "To protect, to serve, to honor," I didn't just hear vows. I heard the echo of every moment I'd served without being seen. And suddenly, all of it had a place. Not everyone gets to stand in a space built from sacrifice and still call it joy. After the ceremony, James turned to me. He reached up and brushed his thumb across my cheek, still faintly warm from where my father's hand had tried to leave a mark. "Does it hurt?" he asked. I smiled. "Not anymore." He looked at me, not with sympathy, but with pride. "They won't remember the slap," he said softly. "They'll remember how you stood." I didn't say a word, because I knew he was right. The slap wasn't the story. The story was that I didn't flinch, didn't fall, didn't break. That moment wasn't about humiliation. It was about reclamation, of my voice, of my name, of the space I had fought so long to stand in without apology. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I wasn't carrying the weight of proving anything. I was simply walking in the truth of who I had become. Not Victor Draper's daughter, not someone's shame, not a bargaining chip. I was Millicent, and they would remember me for how I stood, not for who tried to knock me down.